It is apparently the age of colored pencil reviews on my channel, because here we have another one. These are the Derwent Inktense Watercolor Pencils. I originally had 1 or 2 pencils, and I have no idea where they came from, but I made this piece and I decided, oh, this looks good. So I'm going to buy a 24 set of them and see whether or not they're just as good as this one that is probably at least 5 years older than any of the rest of the ones in this set. Now, I will give a disclaimer. I did film this in July of 2020. Hopefully this isn't posted literally 2 years after this was originally filmed, but who knows? It could be. I make no promises to myself about posting on a consistent schedule with long-form content anymore. But anywho, on to the sketch. So initially I tried doing this in a smaller watercolor sketchbook, but I didn't see the potential in that pose, which is a shame because I really see it now that I'm looking back at it, but I ended up going for this larger piece, which now I feel is a little bit too empty, but I was aiming for an empty, kind of forsaken feeling with this piece. It's a Reaper person who has been defeated with her own weapon, maybe when she was trying to go after someone that was intended to be taken by a Reaper. The big open spaces were also pretty intentional. I wanted to give myself as much room to test out some gradients with these watercolor pencils. Gradients aren't necessarily my forte, which brings me to, I'm not a professionally trained watercolor artist or colored pencil artist. I am coming at this review with a complete novice view of these supplies. So with watercolor pencils, I feel like they don't really act good as colored pencils, and they don't act usually as the best watercolors. Maybe I just haven't found the right one, but I can never get these to act quite the way that I want them to. You have to find a way to make their scratchiness and splotchiness work for you, and as a person who prefers flat textures, these aren't my jam. My first complaint with these is the black is not a very pigmented black. It's really more of a blue-gray, a Payne's gray, but I couldn't get it dark enough by pressing hard. I didn't want to impress a whole lot of the colored pencil texture into it, so I was trying to be delicate but also get a good amount on the paper, and it just wasn't dark enough. I did have to go back over it multiple times. Then for the sand texture, I tried going in with a larger full spread area instead of doing it piecemeal like I did the sky, and I ended up not putting down enough color on the first time around, so again I had to go back through and recolor the entire sand area. Once I have all of the color for the character and the foreground items, it just looks like there isn't any paint at all on the sand. One of the big disadvantages for going through and recording audio for a piece that I did 2 years ago now, I don't have all of the pieces of my memory together. I don't remember why I decided to do the line art after doing sections of the watercolor. I know I've seen people do all of the watercolor and then do the line art, or they do the line art and then the watercolor, but I kind of like split the difference, and I don't understand quite why I did that, but I do absolutely love this line art process. This character design is one of my favorites from that entire era of my art, and it's a shame because at the time I really didn't like this art piece. I thought it was too empty, I didn't like the texture of the watercolor, and I really couldn't see past that. But the fortunate thing about going back and recording audio for a piece that you did years ago is that you can now appreciate your growth. Like, I think I can see where I started to get my game together for color balance. It is a little hard to get the color balance with these, especially since the sky, I ended up having to go in and repaint 3 times. There's just all of this splotchiness I didn't like. But for the character who is slowly sliding by, Thank you, phone stand, for falling out of your base. But for the character, I really like how saturated I went with her in comparison to this really bland world. Maybe there's some story behind that where she's a Reaper who doesn't quite fit into this world, she's not good at her job, and therefore she got defeated. Or maybe she's really good at her job, her outfit shows that she's a wealthy Reaper, and this person happened to just get the upper hand, and she wasn't expecting it, which is why she is so torn up by this defeat, and literally torn up. I can see where my direction as far as my color choices started to change in this piece, because I can think of some other pieces from the time that I went just ham on the saturation and the darkness, and here I can see a clear difference between the character and a saturated color palette and the background in this really faded, vacant area. So for these watercolor pencils, there's a few gripes. First, saturation. They're not the most saturated thing in the world. Because of this, I ended up having to re-wet areas that didn't really need, like, if it were a more pigmented colored pencil, I wouldn't have had to re-wet the paper so often, and it wouldn't be so warped. The top of the paper actually kept popping up while I was doing this. For frame of reference, this is the Canson 140 pound / 300 GSM paper, and I very rarely have any warping problems with this except when I'm using paint markers. Once you do have it laid down, there are very slight differences in the color tones. This piece that I did just before this one, and I regret not filming for this actually, you can see that all of this area is really splotchy, and there's a lot of weird color tone differences. I actually only used one color for at least like all of this area on her skin. Then if you go over any of the wet areas with the colored pencil, you're never getting that texture out. That's partially why I had to go back in and redo parts of the sky, because it's just bad. Going back in and having to redo the gradient around the moon was a little unfortunate. It made the contrast that was already in the moon look like there was barely no contrast at all, and I don't think I went back and retouched that, which makes it look like the moon is just a very shakily done white circle in the sky. So overall, I think the sky is the worst part of this entire piece. Well, in contrast, I absolutely love the colors I used on the clouds. So clouds are A+, the rest of the sky we can just toss in the garbage. While going through and doing the shadowing and like more depth on the sand, I realized I could have attempted to backlight any of this, but this is watercolor and I'm a coward. I didn't want to mess up the things that I already liked, and also it could have created some weird textures. The blue was an interesting choice, but it is something we're going to live with. When it was time for highlights and stars, my Sakura Jelly Roll pen absolutely did not want to get on the area. It just kept lifting the color. I brought in my Molotow Signal White pen, and that worked okay. It still did lift a little bit. I had to really dollop the paint on there. At one point, for the stars, I just kind of gave up on using the pen and switched over to a very tiny paintbrush that I have, and that was able to get me the fine details that I really wanted. I did buy these paintbrushes to be able to paint D&D minis, so if you're interested in seeing that, maybe give this video a like? Then when it came time to finally peel this little baby, it revealed an area where the paint did seep underneath of it. I don't know if that's because this washi tape isn't particularly the stickiest, it is an older washi tape, or if re-wetting the paper so many times caused it to lift a little bit, but I was able to mostly get rid of that with the white pen. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any additions to her story, maybe a name, maybe more to her backstory, I would love to collaborate on this with you. Thank you for joining me while I bring this fiction to life, and I hope you guys join me for the next one.